Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Gameplay footage is from certain campaigns that I've played as Belegar, as Greasus, and so on. But the question I want to answer in this video is one of the questions that is the big topic of discussions right now in the Total War community, and that is difficulty. Is Total War Warhammer 3 too easy? The answer from my perspective, to put it simply, is both yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the mid to late game is significantly easier than it was in, say, Warhammer 2 or even the Realms of Chaos. But at the same time, when we're thinking about the early game in particular, absolutely not. You play certain factions in this game, or a lot of factions in this game, you're going to deal with legions of troops attacking your provinces, you're going to deal with constant raiders, you're going to deal with AI being a constant annoyance. And I don't necessarily think it's that much easier. I do actually want to applaud Creative Assembly in a lot of ways for what they've decided to do with difficulty. There are plenty of issues, absolutely, but I do think that they've gone down a better path with Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires than they have before. They've buffed melee, reduced the benefits that the AI has by quite a significant margin, it feels like, in melee compared to before, especially on higher difficulties, nerfed ranged units. So in Warhammer 2, when we would play, what ended up happening is that ranged centric armies, ranged doom stacks, would end up being the best possible way to play the game, as pretty much any faction. It was best for sieges, it was best for open field battles. You would corner camp and wipe the enemy even if the enemy had a significant advantage against you. This is still something you can do, let's make no mistake about that, but it's far less important than it was before. And given all the minor settlement battles, especially on defense, it is actually more important to have an army that is more balanced, which is how the game should be played from my perspective. You don't want people just being pigeonholed down a specific route or another. Right now in Warhammer 3, a lot of army compositions work very well. Now, this in itself creates another issue for certain factions. Kislev as an example, because Kislev, for quite a lot of the early game, only has a handful of units, hybrid units that aren't too great in melee, pretty decent range combatants, but not too great in melee, and do have some ranged issues. So there are certainly some factions that have suffered as a result of it that would have been great otherwise, though Kislev does have plenty of tools in its toolbox, so to speak, to deal with it. So from that perspective, I'd say the early game is okay, though I would certainly argue that some changes still need to be made. The way the AI acts leaves a lot to be desired, and I think it's the AI behavior that's contributing to a lot of the difficulty issues that currently exist in the game, be it that some factions have a too difficult start, or the fact that the mid to late game is way too easy. And what do I mean by AI behavior? I'm not talking battle behavior. There's plenty of cheese, plenty of bad things that the AI does, but I'm not talking here about battle behavior. I'm talking here about campaign behavior. The AI will declare war on you or declare war on other factions even if they have no chance to take you out. They will march dozens and dozens of troops against you, and even if they win, they're just going to get wiped out eventually. It is ridiculous to see this on every level of the game, be it early game, middle game, late game, where the AI just starts sending troops again and again and again against you while they're already at war with other factions, and getting those troops wiped out or significantly damaged, and then the enemies they already have take advantage of that and wipe them out. And that, I feel, is a fairly big problem in terms of the AI behavior, because it does seem like the AI doesn't really have a plan, so to speak. It doesn't have a campaign plan to expand, to take settlements, to grow their empire. It just feels like it's screwing around. For instance, in a campaign that I streamed just today, I was playing the Vampire Counts, and one of the things I noticed is with Azag, the Slaughterer, he had declared war on both me and Draika, and yet his armies, for pretty much the entire game, for dozens of turns, was just sitting in between us, attacking neither of us, because I, on one hand, had a fairly substantial defensive force arrayed against him. I eventually lost him when I tried to inch closer to his territory. He took advantage of that, but I had a substantial enough defensive force that he couldn't have overcome that easily enough, so he couldn't just raid my otherwise undefended provinces. But at the same time, the AI was also not moving to wipe Drake out. He would attack her, he would wipe her armies, weaken her armies, but not wipe her out completely, even though, in this case, the AI had every chance, every opportunity, every tool, everything going for them to wipe out Draca and then move against me, actually, and take me out. But the AI is just really bad at this kind of decision making. It's bad in its build orders, it's bad in its handling of its empire. So I think, fundamentally, although I know it's a sport for Total War players to complain about the AI, but I think the AI just needs better build orders, because the structures it builds don't necessarily make a huge amount of sense in a lot of ways. Better build orders, better priority, and not just playing in a way screw the player and declaring numerous wars across the world. And it's not just like the way it behaves towards you, though it is certainly biased against you as a player to a ridiculously stupid level. But it's also the fact that the AI will, like the AI, what it will do is it sees a province or region next to it. That region is perhaps undefended, and it's like, oh, I'm going to declare war against this faction. I'm going to march an army against this faction. I'm going to take that out, while leaving its own territory weakened as a result of it, and its actual already existing enemies out for blood. The AI just needs to behave in a more logical, sensical fashion, and it just doesn't do that. It feels like it works on a priority system where it works based on certain variables that trigger certain behaviors, like, oh, the enemy is weak in its nearby regions, let me declare war on them. Though it does also get into a clownish territory where, let's say, for instance, an AI faction declares war against you as the player when it's pretty much dead, when it's down to either its last province or its last region, and declares war against you on the player or against other factions for no reason whatsoever, and decides to wage another war that it has no chance of winning. Like, there's just a lot of questionable behavior, and I think that kind of behavior is what really contributes an enormous amount to the issues that the AI has in the mid to the late game in particular. Now, of course, Creative Assembly has also nerfed by a fairly substantial amount the bonuses that the AI does get in the game in general. But the problem is, although it's been nerfed in the early game, and that does make the early game even that less obnoxious than it used to be in Warhammer 2, there are still plenty of substantial problems with that early game difficulty, because if you're fighting against the Skaven faction, like Frat as Kislev as an example, or Clan Moors, or any Skaven faction, Ikit Claw, then early game the Skaven are just going to have a lot of armies, like 2 armies, 2.5 stacks is generally what I see. Clan Rats, Skaven Slaves, all that kind of stuff. Clan Eshin as well as an example. The Cafe has a fairly good time in general with their campaign. Yeah, some people may struggle with that, but if you're fighting against if you have a Skaven faction next to you, you just have to expect that they're going to have those early game stacks. But the problem is the AI, the bonuses the AI gets maybe make it too strong, dependent on which faction you're playing, but maybe make it too strong, give it a bit too much power early game, which makes the early game not just challenging, but also really frustrating in a lot of ways. But those bonuses are clearly not enough for the mid to late game. So what do I think should be done when it comes to difficulty? How do I think this should be resolved instead of just, clamoring for a better AI? We've been clamoring for a better AI since the beginning of Total War, since the first Total War, right? Since Shogun 1, Medieval 1, Rome 1, Medieval 2, we've always wanted better AI. But that's not the be-all and end-all. Giving the AI significant bonuses or improving it wouldn't necessarily solve the issues. I think a more gradual approach to every level of difficulty would be a solution. Because right now it does feel like Creative Assembly is looking at the perspective, okay, the AI is going to be challenging early on, but once you get the steamroller going, and you need to get the steamroller going as a player, because this is the problem. If you don't get that steamroller going, you're just going to be overwhelmed. So the way you need to play the game on Legendary very hard is you need to become unstoppable. But the problem is you become unstoppable early game, and this was already an issue in Warhammer 1 and 2, Warhammer 1 and 2, yes. You would become unstoppable in the early game, and then the AI couldn't stop you in the mid-late game. This was already an issue. The difficulty curve that was inverted in those games and is inverted in a significant fashion in Warhammer 3, but it does feel like Creative Assembly in the Warhammer series of Total War has always looked at the end game situations as providing the challenge the player needs, but that's not necessarily a solution. I feel the end game crises should be something on top of that, not relying on them to provide the player with a good amount of challenge and fun in their campaigns, because it's not fun to steamroll, just as it isn't fun to have constant frustration with certain factions in particular in the early game. Now, it's only for certain factions because certain factions are so powerful right now and very well designed in a lot of cases, like the Vampire Counts, the Greenskins, the Warriors of Chaos. They've got a lot of things going for them that even though you have a lot of early game challenges, you can overcome them. And it can actually lead to some very fun campaigns, though there are issues that do come up from this as well. There are certainly design issues that do come up when it comes to this, even with those campaigns as well. So I think like a more gradual increase in difficulty would be welcome. And what would I mean by gradual increase? Well, let's say the AI starts with a certain level of income bonuses, upkeep bonuses, growth bonuses, etc. And those bonuses grow. I feel they get too much right now in the early game. Way too much growth, way too much upkeep, etc. They are just ridiculous right now. They get too much in the early game. They get too little in the late game. I imagine the bonuses stay the same. So I think a more gradual increase, like a reduction in the early game, and then like let's say after 30 turns, something like that, or 20 turns, 25 turns, they start getting bonuses, or like every 10 turns or so, they start getting benefits to upkeep, to income, etc., so that they do become more powerful. And maybe only the legendary lords of the AI should be affected by this. Not every minor AI faction should be the ultimate challenge for the player, but the legendary lords should provide that higher level of challenge. And I think those kind of benefits, especially giving the legendary lords more benefits than the minor factions, would push the game in the direction where you start seeing AI empires across the map that you then have to deal with. Also, better behavior with diplomacy. Can we get rid of the bias against the player? It's just utter trash the way it works right now, that I may be rank 1 and everyone's declaring war against me when they have absolutely no reason to do so. It's not really fun having to deal with that. Now, I'm not saying the steamroller should be, I'm not saying the player should have all the freedom in the world. The player should have to deal with unexpected situations. That's always what's made Total War fun. Those kind of dynamic situations on the campaign where you least expect it, like, oh, an AI faction declares war against you. But right now it's not dynamic, it's not unexpected. You expect AI to want to screw you over. You expect AI to declare war against you. You expect to end up fighting the world, especially as certain factions. You do expect that kind of behavior to take place. And if you expect it to happen all the time, that's not dynamic. That's not an unexpected challenge. That is an expected challenge, which makes the campaigns in general less interesting. And the in-game scenarios should be spiced on top of already what's going on, but shouldn't be the main way that Creative Assembly is creating a mid or late game challenge. Though, of course, you do have flexibility when those events are going to trigger. Now, furthermore, there's something else I do want to add to this video. There's too many, and this does contribute to difficulty. There's the way siege maps right now work, be it walled sieges or minor settlement battles, is not that great. Outside of like Imperial maps or Dwarven maps, a lot of map types just really heavily favor the attacker as opposed to the defender, which should not be the case. The defender should be the one with walls, barricades, and towers who should have the advantage. But it absolutely does feel right now that if I'm the one attacking a settlement or a camp, that I'm the one that has all the flexibility, because I can decide where I want to attack. I have the flexibility of, deciding which corridors I'm going to take advantage of, or sending a force down the main entrance, then sending a flanking force down a secondary entrance, maybe stopped by barricades, or massing my ranged units at the main entrance And something that even if you were a player, you can't really mass your ranged units to defend a particular entrance because they won't be able to have those lines of fire that you so desperately need. That is a major, major problem currently in sieges and defense battles in general, that the attacker has every single advantage. It is much easier to attack a settlement than it is to defend it. Doesn't unless you have really high-level towers available, and even then, not necessarily so, because those towers outside of the wall towers, those towers within a settlement, they'll have issues with line of sight. They'll have issues actually hitting the enemy that they're meant to. Now, I'm not saying towers should be overpowered. I think barricades and towers can be fairly obnoxious, absolutely, but I do feel like that attacking an ogre camp with a full garrison should be a monumental effort, but it's not. I feel like sieging a city should not be a cakewalk. And yet more and more and more, the more I play Total War Warhammer 3, especially in Immortal Empires, what I discover more and more is that I want to attack a minor settlement in particular, because I know that even if the army that I'm attacking is vastly superior to mine, I'll have every singular advantage in the world because I can concentrate my force, I can flank the enemy. And sure, the AI won't just concentrate its own forces in a blob, it'll try and spread them out. But regardless of what you do, regardless of the tactics you're using, whether blobbing your units up, concentrating your own force as a defender, or spreading them out to hold as many control points, you are going to be at a significant disadvantage compared to the defender. And this obviously does contribute to the way the way the difficulty currently works in the game, because it pushes players to always be on the offensive. If being on the defensive is just something that doesn't work, and it doesn't work not just because of minor settlement battles, it also doesn't work because if you're trying to stay on the defensive as a player on the campaign map, you're just going to have a lot less money, a lot less territory, a lot less income. Instead, if you go on the offensive, you start looting, sacking, raising settlements, you end up with mountains and mountains of gold. It doesn't matter that your entire home region is on fire, because you are gaining tens of thousands of gold through looting and sacking. Doesn't matter what's happening back home if you can keep that momentum going. And I don't think that's how a game should be. And I'm not saying it should be the only way that defending or a more defensive oriented approach should be the only way, but I certainly think that it should have more value than the way things currently are. So fundamentally, the issues right now in the difficulty are not just based on the AI behavior or the benefits that AI may or may not have. It's also design issues with the game. The huge benefit of being on the offensive, you get hero levels, you get lord levels, you get a lot of money. As opposed to on defensive, you gain significantly less than that, and you're ceding the initiative to your foes. And this is something that the way the game currently works right now, it does heavily favor aggression as opposed to defense. It favors conquering as much, even if you lose everything you take, and you end up at war with the entire world. A great example would be Grom the Punch. He may have every single faction around him declare war against him, but he doesn't care because he'll still win. Because he'll have so much money from looting, sacking settlements that he'll be able to raise whatever force he wants. He just needs to have at least one province where he can raise that, and he gets significant bonuses to global recruitment to allow that to happen. So I think right now the game is too heavily slated in favor of the attacker that forces you to do that. And again, it doesn't just affect the player, it affects the AI as well. The problem, of course, the AI is actually too passive, or it's polite, or even when it's aggressive, the way it's aggressive doesn't make sense. If I'm playing, let's say, the Warriors of Chaos, I know that none of my major settlements are ever, throughout the entire campaign, going to be under threat because they're strong, sturdy settlements, and the AI generally avoids even looking at those. Like, it looks at those, it's like, I'm not going to bother with that. So what's the AI plan? Like, it all combines into the current problems that the game has. Now, I do not believe, going back to the style of difficulty that we had in Warhammer 2, which I personally found very frustrating and annoying to deal with. I don't find that as a good idea, but I certainly think that we need a better path forward in terms of design of difficulty in the game. Now, finally, before I end this video, I do want to just mention this about the minor settlement battles. What do I think should be done about them? Besides a complete redesign, design of terrain, the way towers work, all that. Well, I think one thing that would help any minor settlement or siege battle would be this. Allow the player or the AI, the one who's defending, allow them the flexibility to decide what kind of battle they're going to fight when they get attacked in their settlement. Do they want to fight a settlement battle, or do they want to fight in the open field? Give players and AI that flexibility. Because quite often, and more often than not, as I've said, the attacker has every advantage on the defensive. Some cases not so, but I think having that flexibility, especially as the player, would make these battles far more interesting when you are defending. It would make up for some of the deficiencies that currently exist. It wouldn't be a fix, so to speak. It would be more of a temporary solution, if you will. But I do think that kind of flexibility would be very welcome currently in the game. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications. If you do enjoy the content, join my Discord. I post when I do videos, when I stream over there. Much easier to keep track of all of that. And so if you want to keep up to date with me, go there. And I'll see you next time.